Hi, this is the show that answers the questions that expats, nomads, and full-time travelers living across the globe ask themselves every day. These insights and secrets are shared when we interview experts and authors from across the globe. Hello, welcome to Nomadic Diaries. Today it is my pleasure to be interviewing Joel Bond. And Joel is an author. He has been working overseas, specifically in Iraq, for 7 years. The name of his first book was As Large as Your Spirit, and it's a reverse refugee memoir. Welcome, Joel. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Doreen. This is a pleasure.
Let me ask you, what is a reverse refugee?
Ooh, good question. So I wrote this first book of mine while I was living in Iraq and had, during the pandemic, accidentally got stuck in Greece, quarantined. So I was attempting to get back to my home in Iraq. The premise, the sort of arc of the story really is, here I am, a man from the West, caught in Greece, trying to get back to the Middle East. And while I was there, encountered all of these refugees from the Middle East caught in Greece trying to get to the West. And so our lives intersected. I ended up working in the refugee camp for 2.5 months, teaching English, and really transformed the way that I thought about myself, thought about the idea of home, and thought about global migration. So reverse refugee is the sense of not just trying to get back to a place that many people were trying to get away from, but also the metaphorical context of trying to find a place to call home, finding that place where you're a refugee from your own heart sometimes when you're a global nomad, and finding that space that really you say, this is mine, this is my home.
I love that terminology. You're a refugee from your own heart. Could you expand on that a wee bit more for our listeners?
Indeed. I think as we go through life, we encounter so many different experiences that really challenge our identities. We're thrown outside of our comfort zones. We're thrown into new situations, things that we're not sure how to navigate or negotiate the environments that we find ourselves in. And sometimes that can bring up some really uncomfortable emotions in ourselves. And really finding that space to process through that information, to process through those experiences, I think is really key, especially when you're in that globally nomadic environment. You have a lot of headspace, really, a lot of time when you're not inundated with all this, language input that is fluent for you, sometimes, or a culture that's known to you. You end up having a lot of headspace sometimes to think about yourself and have that introspection. And so the pandemic for me really just turned the volume down on that external noise a lot, because here I am already in a foreign culture, and now with all this extra time to really think about my own situations in life and who I wanted to be and who I wanted to become. And so in the book, it really unpacks a lot of the sort of personal details, and it's a very personal memoir, but it's a very engaging story as well.
Excellent. So listeners, you heard it here first. I assume it's on Amazon, correct?
It is, yes. Yeah. Amazon.com. You can look for it. It's under my full name, Joel David Bond. And As Large as Your Spirit.
As Large as Your Spirit by Joel David Bond. So tell us a little bit more. You were in Iraq, a different era from when I lived in the Middle East. Now, I lived in the Middle East in the 70s. And then I went back in the 90s and stayed until 2011, almost. And we were in Saudi Arabia with F-16s taking off from half a mile away at the airbase, fully loaded, multiple sorties a day. But you were on the other end of that. Shortly afterwards. I don't think you were there during the hot part. Tell us about when you arrived in Iraq and a little bit about the post-Iraq war situation there, please.
Yeah, so I ended up moving into Iraq in 2016, right at the tail end of ISIS. They were still active in the country, but were defeated in January of 2017. So I'd only been there for a few months by the time they were declared disbanded. And the country really found itself, reeling from decades of war. I mean, it really, the education system, the sector that I worked in, was just shattered. 90% of school facilities across the country had been damaged through conflict. So students, I had friends that I had made there who hadn't graduated high school and were in their mid 20s, 23, 24 years old, because there'd been so many delays and closures and
Yes.
etc. So, they were really reeling from a broken system, but very quickly they found themselves reopening up to the modern world. And so there's a lot of investment that came in now that ISIS was gone. And so money poured into the country in terms of infrastructure, oil
Mhm.
wealth, development, building projects. But what was quickly discovered is that kind of up and to the right on paper in terms of economic growth, it was on paper up and to the right, but a lot of that money that was being funneled in came from foreign investors that got funneled right back out. So
Oh,
the
wow.
local population really found themselves in an economic squeeze. So,
And
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 that's
they were not the beneficiaries of a lot of this investment. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, yeah, not particularly. So, while there was a lot of development and new shopping malls, I remember the day the shopping mall opened in the city where I lived. There had been no big shopping center. And it was this huge event. They had, a big balloon drop and thousands of people showed up in the concourse of this mall. And,
Yes.
it was this big, massive, occasion. And, by American standards, it was, a normal size shopping center. But for there, this was just this, massive achievement.
Yeah, was it IKEA by any chance? Because I remember there was an opening in the Middle East of an IKEA where people were killed in the queues.
Oh goodness, no. So,
Okay. I
yeah,
don't know what year that was. This really
no,
dates me.
no, it was a Carrefour supermarket. That was the anchor store in that mall,
Mhm.
which is a large global French
Know it
supermarket.
well.
So, and that was really kind of a delight to be living in the Middle East as, an American British citizen dual here, and all of a sudden having this French supermarket chain and recognizing all this product packaging in French and
Sure.
sort of thinking, where am I in the
Yeah.
world when I have all
It's
this.
confusing. And I remember thinking about when we shopped at Carrefour, I remember thinking about the Arabs and, their linguistic abilities. They could manage Arabic really well and they could speak English,
Mhm,
many of them fluently, some of them
mhm.
just a little piece. But then I thought, boy, now they have to become trilingual because everything was in French. I do recall that.
Yeah, it's really impressive actually when you live overseas, the number of languages that people can navigate through.
Yes. Yeah.
The joke, of course, is a person who speaks three languages is trilingual, two languages is bilingual, and one language is American.
It's a
I'm very
sad
grateful for the
commentary.
opportunities to learn more and to actually be able to converse and get my
Yeah.
way through.
It's a sad commentary, isn't it,
It
about
is.
our linguistic skills. So tell me, were you in the green zone? Tell me, where were you geographically? Give us a picture of the geography of Iraq and tell us about approximately where you were,
Mhm.
please.
Yeah, so Iraq's a fairly large country, somewhere sort of slightly smaller than the state of Texas, I suppose we would compare it size-wise. And I was in the north, in the Kurdistan region, in a city called
Oh,
Sulaymaniyah. Yeah. It's
mhm.
very mountainous. It would snow in the winter, it'd be super cold, totally defied your expectations of what you thought a Middle Eastern country would be like. It was
Yes.
about an hour and a half drive from the border with Iran. And during my 7 years there, got to explore everything from Basra in the south of Baghdad all the way to Zaho in the north.
Wow.
So was
Wow.
really able to explore a lot. But it wasn't until the last 2 to 3 years of living there that federal Iraq opened up for tourists to visit. So my time started in the Kurdistan region with a visa specific only for Kurdistan.
Mhm.
And then as the country opened up, I was able to go down and visit Baghdad,
Mhm.
Nasiriyah, the marshes, the
Yes.
holy pilgrimage sites of Karbala and Najaf, Babylon, and the ancient cities there. And really had such a great time exploring the diversity of culture there because there
Sure.
is way more diverse than people,
Sure.
assume. When I tell people
Sure.
I lived in Iraq, they thought, Arabs, camels, and sand, right? And while that does exist, it's a very small
Yes.
percentage of the actual
Yes.
population, the culture that's there. So,
Yeah. Fascinating. Now, I have to ask you, did you have one of those Kurdistan wool caps that are flat on the top? You can make them longer. You know the ones I mean that the Kurds wear? I had some of those at one point. I don't own them anymore, but I sure wish I did some days.
yes, I have a traditional Kurdish outfit. I actually have two. I have a black one and a very like deep royal purple, which is just beautiful. I had made for the Nowruz celebration, which is the Zoroastrian New Year. And I do have some headgear that goes with that. And they also have the traditional Arabic dishdasha from the south. So I've got a combination, variety of traditional clothing from the area. The Arabic clothing I tended not to wear so much simply because I was in a predominantly Kurdish region. But I would wear my Kurdish clothes on a fairly routine basis. School events, special events, anytime there's a special holiday. If I was going to a wedding, I'd wear my Kurdish clothes because that was the way to dress up.
And also because I think that when you have lived in a country that is war-torn, damaged, and had your life disrupted to that sort of degree, I notice how people cling to celebrations, and that happens in Mexico as well. And Mexico and the Middle East are very similar in their cultural comparisons in some areas. So it's important to celebrate.
Yeah, I think in terms of time orientation, I think there's be a lot of similarities. The one that really took me a long time to get acculturated to is that sort of the present now is the only moment concept in Kurdish culture. As with my Northern European ancestry, I'm very planned and focused and vision oriented. What's the future goal, right? I want to know what the plan is, put things in the calendar. That's just my sort of German heritage. But my Kurdish friends in a lot of the Middle East is very now focused. It's the here and now. This is the moment. The past is gone. Tomorrow's unknown. So let's be here right now in the moment. And so that took me a little bit of time to actually get used to the spontaneity of living there. It's very spontaneous, but delightful when you would embrace it.
I often very reminded of that fact when I'm out and about in Mexico and something strikes me and I feel like I'm back in the Middle East. I go, it's one of those 7 intercultural principles that rule us, but they rule us from a very subconscious place.
Yes.
We're mostly not aware of them. So tell us about, were you working and embedded in a local school or an international school?
I was working in an international school. The clientele there was about 80% Kurdish, I would say. Another sort of 10 to 15% Arabic from the south of the country, and the remainder were expat children, But it was fairly, they were locals who lived there. A lot of them were repatriated Kurds. So when Saddam Hussein was in power, a lot of these Kurdish families had fled to Europe, North America, Australia, and abandoned their businesses and their posts and their positions in government. And when Saddam Hussein fell, those families slowly filtered back into the country. So, but while they had been away, they had their own families and had children and had put them into education. And so now they're coming back to reopen the family business or, take up that position in politics again. And now they've got these children that are used to a Western style of education coming back to a society that has a very fractured education system. And a lot of that money then got put into that growing international school sector. So we had fairly high profile students at the school. But at the same time, I really had a heart for making sure that these kids who would be the next leaders of the country, they're in positions of power, or their parents were, I wanted to make sure that they developed a level of empathy with the way the world really is. So during my time as the English teacher, I shifted roles in the school a few times, but as English teacher with the senior year students, I developed a volunteer service learning project where they had to read journal entries from very famous volunteers in the past, and then commit to doing 12 hours of volunteer service throughout the course of the year and write their own reflective journal entries in the process. And as part of that volunteer service, I coordinated with a number of refugee agencies and internally displaced persons agencies, and had the students go in and volunteer to bring in donations, play with the kids, learn what it was like to live in a refugee camp. And I remember the day that I took the senior year class, the last year that I did that program before the pandemic, and we drove into the refugee camp and distributed all these toys to these kids, these little kids who were displaced from other places in Iraq, had no homes, lived in these tents, had shared bathroom blocks just on these concrete poured foundations in the middle of the field. And as we left, we got onto the bus to go back to the school at the end. And I did a debrief with the students and asked, what did you learn? What did you feel? Did you discover anything that was surprising? How will this
Mhm.
change you in the future?
Yeah.
And could see a lot of the students had been really emotionally affected. They were really kind of touched and moved by this experience. I
Yes.
sat
Yeah.
down, and my co-chaperone who had gone with me just sort of patted me on the leg, and he says, "Well done, like you've made a
Yeah.
difference."
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I sobbed. I broke down on the
Yeah.
bus because it
Yeah.
was just so incredible to see this interaction between what's
Yes.
essentially the world's wealthiest 1% now
Yes.
engaging with the 1% of the displaced,
Yes.
and making those, again, intercultural connections even within their own
Yeah.
space. These kids had this refugee camp was in the backyard of some of these students, right there.
And they probably had never been there before or seen such a thing. I have heard stories, and actually, that has happened in our family when our daughter went to um, Zululand in Africa, and where the
Mhm.
children, they were doing volunteer work at a school where the children walked to school 10 miles each day
Yeah.
barefoot. And the reports from the teachers upon the reflections was that this is making a difference for these children. And when I have had those experiences, it's almost like the tectonic plates of my being move a little bit. Do you get that sense? And what do you hope that those children will take forward to the future from this?
Yeah, I certainly felt that day. I felt that there had been a shift in kind of how
Mhm.
I saw the world and how I wanted to live and breathe and move in this world. And what I really hoped that the students would get out of it as well, that they would see that same impact that they could have. Not just the impact they would have on others, but also the impact that that kind of work would have on themselves. And I actually did a follow-up with a lot of those students several years later and asked if they remembered that situation, circumstance, if they remembered the project at all, what they took away from it, what behaviors they've adapted. An overwhelming majority of them really said that they had developed a lot more self-reflection. They'd gotten
Yes,
into journaling. They had more of a focus on news and current events.
yes,
They were more focused on how they managed their time and what they
yes,
would do with that time in service of others. And it was really it was fascinating to see that that one project really did have a lasting impact on these
yeah.
students.
And so, what was the name of the city that you were living in?
Suleymaniye. The
Oh,
local, yeah,
yeah.
Slimani is the Kurdish dialect.
Well, you're really giving us a flavor of a part of the world that I don't think is very frequently explained or described to us people who live in the American continent, because
Mhm.
we have the perception that Iraq is, number one, a mess and problematic. And actually, there are big functioning. I just want listeners to know that we're hearing from someone who knows that there are super functioning cities and people back there who are living amazing lives, even in the midst of this.
It's true. And when I first took the position to go there, I said to my mother that I was moving to Iraq, and she didn't talk to me for 2 days.
Wow.
But in the end, I mean, it was for a number of reasons, really. She was busy, and our schedules were conflicting or whatever. But when we finally touched base again, I said, "Listen, have you ever heard of the city Sulmania, mother?" And she's like, "No, I've never heard of it." I was like, 2 million people live in and
Yes,
around that city, and you've never heard of it because it never makes the news. That's two
yes,
million people who get up and take their kids to school and walk the
yes,
dog and go to the supermarket and buy
yes,
milk and go to the football
yes,
game. And they do all the things that we would do. It just happens to be in a part of the world that has a bad reputation on the news. And I said, the news is 1% of reality. It's real, the news, but it's only
yes,
1%. It doesn't
yes.
represent the whole of the society and culture. And that's what I really found once I arrived. I went with a little bit of fear and trembling, thinking I wouldn't stay for more than 2 months. And 7 years I stayed and,
Yes,
dug my
I
heels in.
understand. I went to Saudi Arabia for 5 and stayed for 15. It's very, in a way, the Middle East is very seductive, I find. I don't know if that was your experience, but I learned tolerance. I learned their value of hospitality and family.
I think just again, that hospitality is one of the key things, I think. To refuse hospitality is an insult. And so just always making sure that you are both offering and receiving hospitality because it's such a huge integral part of the culture. And again, like you said, it is very seductive, that part of the world, because I think as people on the North American continent from the Western society, we take a look at the Middle East and think that it should feel somewhat similar to what we know, but it is culturally very different,
It
very,
is.
very different. And
It
so
is.
there's a lot of facets to explore
Yes.
in
Yeah.
society and culture and family and connection. And, those, like you mentioned earlier, those 7 intercultural traits, the sort of spectra that we fall on.
Right.
And it was just absolutely fascinating to be there and to integrate into the society as much as I could.
Yes. Well, congratulations on that. So you were there for 7 years. What would you like to tell us about leaving?
I am at liberty to say a certain amount, and I think it's such an interesting story. It's worth sharing. It's also probably worth noting at this point, it was very traumatic, and so I cannot guarantee the quality of my response as I talk about it.
Sure.
But I would like to share because I think it's
We're
fascinating.
not looking for polish here on Nomadic Diaries. Here on Nomadic Diaries, we want to get down and dirty and raw because the mobile life is messy.
It is
And
messy.
I just like to say we all live messy lives. Somewhere in our lives there is a mess. And
Yeah.
it is perfectly okay to fall in love with that mess because this is the way that we create order in our minds. So just feel free to categorize this in the way that best serves you.
Leaving Iraq was it was difficult. One, because I fell in love with it. It was a beautiful culture, such hospitable people. And when you spend so much time in a place, you develop really deep connections, relationships, friendships. You put roots down over time.
Yes.
And I think, when you live the sort of nomadic lifestyle, you sort of eschew that idea of like, oh, I'm never going to put down roots. I'm never going to settle, right? I'm always going to move someplace new. And yet, despite your best intentions, you always do put down roots. You do connect.
Yeah.
And every time you have to sort of uproot, it is really a traumatic experience. I think for me in particular, I mean, it was exceptionally traumatic because it came without warning. I had been there for 7 years and intended to stay for several more. I didn't know how long I was going to stay, but definitely had the intention of being there for longer when the conflict between Israel and Gaza broke out. And just due to...
Is this last October?
Yes, just this last October. Yeah, so okay, October 7th.
This is very recent and very raw from your diary. This is a page from your diary that is so recent and raw.
Yes, very much so. And in many ways, I'm still processing it, trying to figure out how to make sense of it. Yes. I may never really have a solid why, a reason why, but as long as I can, like you said, fall in love with the mess of it and be okay, Yes. But yeah, the conflict broke out in early October, and my mother called and she said, is everything safe, everything fine? And I said, yes, that's 2 countries away. It's fine. There's no, yes. no influence here, where I'm in. Kurdistan's very safe and very stable. But for whatever reason, I had a fairly high profile in the region. I was known to people, both expats and locals, had a social media presence, had a book that had been published, had given talks up and down the country, had been to Baghdad and down in the south. And however I got on somebody's radar, I did. And the State Department caught wind of that as well and gave me a direct phone call asking me, telling me that it was really unsafe for me to remain in my current situation and that I needed to change as quickly as possible. That phone conversation went back and forth for a while. It was actually multiple phone calls over the space of 24 hours, but that resulted in me essentially having to leave. So I had basically a day to pack everything, pack up my entire life, and evacuate. Pretty much unknown. I didn't know who to trust at that point because it really had come as a surprise. And so I left the country without having told anybody apart from 2 close friends who drove me to the airport. And it wasn't until after I had safely arrived back in the US that I felt at liberty to then announce to my workplace, what had happened and why I was gone and that I wouldn't be able to come back. So that's been really a difficult situation to sort of be whiplashed back to my birth culture.
Yes.
that I'd been away from for the better part of 20 years, actually. I'd been abroad in various places. And so all of a sudden I'm whiplashed back here. So that, you'd had a very traumatic transition out and then a very dramatic transition back to a place that,
Yeah.
didn't really feel like home, but was by merit of birth and family. So
Yes. There has been some studies done on repatriation, not as many as I would love to see, but people who are repatriated under very, very dramatic and traumatic situations, it does seem to take longer. Obviously there's much more processing. There's so much more to say and
yeah,
so much more to evaluate and then find your new equilibrium in your next experience. And
yeah,
so here at Nomadic Diaries, we do really respect the power of repatriation
yeah,
because in many ways we see ourselves putting our body on a plane and our belongings on a truck or a container and moving that part. But what is not usually addressed is our mental health, our soul, our cellular situation, and what I call the second suitcase with all the your
all the
six
hidden
mental
baggage.
faculties and all your hidden baggage, which is way more important. And of course, everything you've brought back with you now all has to
Hmm.
be unpacked and processed and neatly ordered
Hmm.
in a way that you can, rebuild your life, right?
Yeah, to find that new space in that new
Yeah,
environment, really.
yeah.
And emotionally, I mean, in the best of situations, repatriation is hard because you have built a life somewhere else and you're having to rebuild somewhere new again.
Exactly.
And in my particular case, it was just incredibly abrupt. And it took
Yeah.
weeks. I did, if we're going to be raw and emotional, I went to therapy for PTSD. I thought people were
Sure.
after me for a while. It took a long
Sure.
time to get used to just feeling like I was okay.
Hey, we're
So
only 4 months, 5 months out from this experience, so I wouldn't
it's
categorize
still
that.
raw.
Yeah, it's still raw, and it should be. And
Hmm.
5 months is not a long time.
No, it really isn't. It really isn't.
I'm
So
still processing repatriation from 40 years ago. The first one was so damaging that I
yeah,
continually revisit it because it continually shines light on something that I can make a difference on every day.
yeah,
And so, it's turning that crappy stuff into a gift
yeah.
that is our challenge nowadays. So we wish you the best of success with this journey. And I would love to interview you again, Joel, in order to see where you are in 6 months or so.
Yeah. I mean,
You'll have so
I,
much more to say.
I will for sure, for sure. And like you said, it is very recent and very, this is not, we're not long out from the situation, this
No.
repatriation. But I think one of the things that has really helped me be resilient in this, not to say that it's been easy because it hasn't. I mean, there have been nights of tears and lots of
Sure.
terror, to be honest.
Sure.
But I think part of the resilience that came out of my experience in Greece and working with refugees and people
Mm.
who have no place to call home, I think really gave me that level of empathy. And working in those situations really gave me the opportunity to identify
Mhm.
with finding a place to call home. And that home is, yes, the physical belongings and the physical body and that space, but home is also a place where you are known, where you're
Yeah.
safe. That emotional and spiritual security is present.
Yeah.
And when you can take the time to reflect and to really know yourself deeply, you can build a home in many places as long as you give yourself that emotional resilience and time to do so. So we're still in that process, 100%, just to say, but I'm very grateful for the experiences that I have had working with refugees because it really has helped me build that resilience, that emotional resilience.
Sure. So you mentioned that resilience was one of the things that you gained from your and I think empathy. You've mentioned
Mhm.
that a couple of times. Can you speak more to how people who are not in those situations when we're not directly face to face or cheek to cheek with people like that, how can we learn and grow? How can listeners who are not, able to or willing to put themselves on a plane and go to
Mhm.
Solomania, how would you suggest that we can learn these skills and these human characteristics that seem to be being so called forth right now?
Well, Doreen, I think that's a difficult question, a good one
Sorry.
that I think we all really need to ponder because I think it takes some intentionality. It
Yes,
really
it does.
does.
And some
Um,
motivation. It takes
yeah,
motivation and drive.
it really, yeah, really, really does. And if you don't have that intention, if you don't have that motivation, then, you're not going to learn these skills by accident. I'm not going to get a six-pack abs just by thinking of going to the gym. I actually have to go, right? I have to eat well and exercise
Exactly.
and do that sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Same thing with your intercultural skills. You have to have that motivation and intention and then follow through with it. And I think one of the key steps is being willing to put yourself outside your comfort zone and
Yeah.
connect. And it doesn't have to be overseas. It can be across the street. Look
Yes.
at the melting pot of America, where we are now. It's very intercultural in many places, in many big cities, and even in many rural areas now.
Yeah.
Still, it's
Yes.
growing more intercultural. And so, putting yourself out there and making those steps to connect with people who might be your neighbor, or the cashier, or the truck driver, or the delivery driver, or the people that you see at the gym, or at the mosque, or the church, or place of worship, wherever you might be. Really seeking to make those connections and then approaching that with open ears,
Yes.
listening to what they have to say, because
Yeah.
everybody has a story.
Yes,
And
everybody does have a story, and we really appreciate you being here to share the highlights, some of the highlights of your story. In closing, can I ask you, what did you think you gained the most from living in the Middle East?
in a word, I would say resilience, just
Excellent.
the ability to adapt and change, go with the flow when things come your way, to just suddenly have to alter course and pick a new direction. Living there, that was an everyday experience. Resilience.
And the beauty of that word, because it's banged around a lot in our modern society, but I don't know that we're all aware of how it can break our hearts open.
I had resilience once likened to the image of a palm tree. And
Mhm.
that resilience is like a palm tree, in that it sways and it bends. It has this
Yes.
sort of motion to it, but it will
Yeah.
always come back to neutral sometime after the storm is past.
Yeah.
The storm won't break the palm tree, it'll sway
Yes.
it, it'll shake it, but
Yes.
it'll always, recenter eventually. And resilience is a bit like that.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much to Joel, and thank you for being here today. And we would just ask that if you have been listening to us, that you can follow us on Apple or Spotify or any of those systems. And if you haven't yet, listeners, please go to Apple or Spotify and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Give us some feedback. So that we can get back to Joel and show him some love and appreciation for being willing to be vulnerable and to share a page out of the diary that is his life as an intercultural expat living overseas. Thank you so much, Joel, for your time and your wisdom.
Thank you, Doreen. It's been a pleasure.